Great.
All
Perfect.
right. Well, so welcome. I'm going to be talking today about ferns, a group of plants that I'm quite fond of. I frequently get asked about what my favorite plant is, and my response is more around what my current plant crush is, because it changes, of course, and it's hard to pick a favorite. But ferns have always ranked fairly highly up there, and so my talk today is going to be a little bit about ferns culturally, and then I'm going to go through a number of our native ferns here in the Northeast, and then we'll end with some tips on how you can grow ferns at home, because it's actually not that difficult. So I'll start with saying that ferns are one of my sort of fascinations with ferns. And I think a general fascination with plants revolves around finding beauty in all moments of their lives. So whether they're emerging out of the ground, as you see here with these tightly curled fiddleheads or croziers, when they do their thing and grow and reproduce, and even in senescence, there's a beauty to be found. But ferns are a evolutionarily ancient group of plants. The fern crozier that you see in the top right, Angiopteris evicta, is called the king fern because it actually is the largest fern that exists on planet Earth right now. In its home in Southeast Asia, the individual fronds can grow up to 8 meters long, which is just stupidly large. And again, to me, it thinks that it's the right scale if you still had dinosaurs and so forth plodding around in the forests. There are tree ferns as well. Those also still exist in temperate rainforests in Central America, and certainly in in the Southern Hemisphere as well. But there's a lot to be said about their forms. I think another thing that I'm oftentimes drawn to in nature are hints at symmetry, and I think that ferns really nail the idea of spirals and circles, and you'll see that kind of throughout the talk here. I used to teach botany at Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, and this was one of the slides that we often talked about, showing the sort of major leaps in plant evolution, and all of this happening on the scale of millions of years, of course. To the best of our knowledge, land plants originated somewhere 400 or 500 million years ago. The very first group to have emerged are your mosses, and mosses are distinct from other groups of plants because they don't have vascular tissue. They don't have the internal plumbing to get tall, and so the evolution of that sort of cellular structure and system and tissue system is the next big leap, and that gives rise to the next group, which are ferns and fern allies. So these are things like club mosses and whisk ferns, and a couple other oddballs. And then from that point on, you move on to seeds, and both mosses as a group and ferns as a group reproduce by making spores, and that'll be important when we get back to at the end of the talk, talking about propagation. And then from there on, seed plants were distinguished by conifers, and then or gymnosperms rather, and then flowering plants and angiosperms. The sort of growth of ferns and fern crazes really originated in Europe in the 1800s with a Scottish man, A. Macanucci, who was the very first to devise a way to grow tropical ferns in an inhospitable climate. And he experimented by basically making the very first terrariums, if you like, in glass cases. A little bit later on, and this is something that maybe people have more knowledge of, Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward made what are called Wardian cases. And so again, this is basically a glass case And he noticed that the air quality in London at the time was so poor that many ferns would not grow unless they were inside of this nice little glass case. And the evolution of the Wardian case actually really achieved or allowed for greater success in the shipping of plants during the colonial empire of the British, as they were tromping around the world and claiming to have discovered new plants and new seeds in other parts of the world and shipping them back to Europe. But all of that sort of innovation, if you'd like, started with attempts to grow ferns. This also kind of coincided with a period in Victorian England that's called Pteridomania, or the fern craze. And this was originally as a term coined by a man named Charles Kingsley. And he was, I'll read you a quote from his book. It says here that your daughters, perhaps having been seized by the prevailing pteridomania and wrangling over unpronounceable names of species, which seem different in each new fern book that they buy, and yet you cannot deny that they find enjoyment in it and are more active, more cheerful, more self-forgetful over it than they would have been over novels and gossips and crochet. And this is from 1855, so put all that into context. Generally speaking, pteridomania is something that is really considered a British eccentricity, although the love of ferns is most certainly spilled over into the United States. One of, I think, a common or sort of modern way to tie this in is a lovely selection of Our Lady fern that I'm showing here. That's called Victoriae, and this was a form of fern that was discovered in Scotland right around the 1860s and named for Queen Victoria because of its distinctive sort of cross shapes. The English and the British take things, of course, they take their gardening very seriously. And so in order to really fully display the diversity of ferns, it led to the creation of a number of what are called ferneries, or special greenhouses that are distinctly dedicated to growing ferns. And you're seeing some examples here from Scotland, from the RHS Benmore garden, and then another one here in Germany at the University of Potsdam. The American Fern Society was established in 1893, so at the height of pteridomania, and now claims to have over 1,000 members worldwide, and it's based at Indiana University, and counts itself as one of the largest international fern clubs in the world. Now, many people have certainly written about ferns, and this particular woman, Frances Theodore Parson, was known for a book that preceded this that was called How to Know Your Wildflowers, but it was published under a pseudonym because the publishers at the time thought that the book would sell better if it had a man's name as opposed to a woman's name, and so it was published under the Mrs. Dana Starr. And again, I have to take a moment to admit that I am a dedicated bibliophile, and I really like old books, particularly books written in the late 1900s and early 1900s, really before the advent of photography. And there's a way in which the authors write about, and they communicate not only cultural information, how to grow these plants, but some sort of story about how they found it and how you might use it in the garden. And so before we sort of dive into the specifics, I wanted to read two passages from How to Know the Ferns by Frances Theodore Parsons, just to set the mood a little bit. So she writes, to me, the greatest charms the ferns possess is that of their surroundings. No other plants know so well how to choose their haunts. You must follow them to nature's most sacred retreats, in remote tangled swamps, overhanging the swift, noiseless brook at the heart of the forest, in the depths of some dark ravine, or high up on a mountain ledge, where the air is purer, the world wider, and life more beautiful than we fancied, where these wild, graceful things are most at home. You will never learn to know the ferns if you expect to make their acquaintance from a carriage along the highway or in the interval between two meals. You must be willing to tramp tirelessly through woods and across fields, to climb mountains and to scramble down gorges. You must be content with what luncheon you can carry in your pocket. And let me tell you this, when at last you fling yourself upon a bed of springing moss and add to your sandwich cresses and fresh dripping from the neighboring brook, you will eat your simple meal with a relish that never attends the most elaborate luncheon within four walls. And when later you surrender yourself to the delicious sense of fatigue and drowsy relaxation which steals over you, mind and body, listening half unconsciously to the plaintive long-drawn notes of the wood birds, breathing the mingled fragrance of the mint at your feet and the pines and hemlock overhead, you will wonder vaguely why on summer days you ever drive along the dusty high road, or eat indoors, or do any of the flavorless conventional things that consume so large a portion of our lives. I just love that passage because it really kind of paints a picture, and it says to me that Mrs. Parsons was somebody who spent a great deal of time outside and who really appreciated the experience of being outside and the experience of seeing these wonderful plants in context and in nature. And it's something that I try to recommend to all of the interns and students and other people that come through the gardens, that the best way to learn how to grow native plants is to go see them in contest and go see them in the wild. So I've arranged the ferns today into sort of four large categories, and they've been arranged in a way based on their growth forms, because I think that if you want to use them or design with them, it's going to be really useful to know whether they form clumps, whether they spread slowly, whether they are running ferns, which will spread much more vigorously, or whether they are sort of habitat specialists, so things that prefer cliff faces and high pH rock and other sorts of specific habitat conditions. And some of those tend to be a little bit more difficult, if not impossible, to cultivate. But again, it's really great to get to know them. So our first group that we're talking about here are going to be clumping ferns. And so these are ferns that tend to produce one single large clump that will grow larger with age and produce more and more fronds. And there's a whole, as you can see, there's a lot of Latin names in here, but there really are wonderful ferns. So we'll dive right in and get started. So first up is the ebony spleenwort. So this is a relatively diminutive fern, maybe growing each frond is 6 to 8 inches tall, and characterized by the very dark black stem that the pinnules or leaflets are attached to. This is not one that will tolerate a lot of heavy leaf litter. And so it's important that you site it in places, as you can see in the bottom right, on a slope or somewhere where it doesn't get buried. But it is a really lovely, charming, small fern. Next, we have Woodsy obtusa, which has a more finely dissected and a little bit more of a delicate appearance. This is not one that is particularly horticulturally available, but it ought to be because it's a very tough little fern, and similarly likes shaded conditions and not a lot of leaf litter. If you have wet areas, royal fern is a really wonderful choice. As you can see in some of the pictures here, the fronds, when they first emerge out of the clump in the springtime, take on this really wonderful coppery color, and they are often found in wetlands at the edge of standing water. They produce a sort of a hummock made of sort of it looks like coarse black sticks, if you'd like, all matted together. And over time, other things will seed into there. It's really it's a really wonderful fern. We've grown it at Garden of the Woods and other places in areas that are not immediately in standing water, and it tends to be fairly forgiving. It's not a drought tolerant fern by any means. A little later on, you see the fronds take on a little bit more of a nicer color. These guys here are probably about 6 feet across. This is from the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and I would suspect that that fern is probably, I don't know, maybe 40 or 50 years old. So in that space of time, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We can also see that royal fern has, and so this is something that I'll comment upon occasionally, ferns and the way that they reproduce will either make a fertile frond, so it's a frond that has the spore-bearing structures on it, or they will make separate fertile fronds and sterile fronds. And royal fern here, you can see in the center of your picture are the fertile fronds. So if you're looking to grow this from spores, those are the ones that you want to pay attention to for ripeness, and that will be able to collect the spores themselves. All of the other fronds are just basically solar panels for the plant, so there's no reproductive structures there. Related to this, and you will oftentimes find them growing together, is interrupted fern. And I really like interrupted fern, particularly you can see the top right picture here from Garden of the Woods. It's a very upright fern. It grows about between 3 to 4 feet when it is mature, and named interrupted because you can see that the sterile fronds kind of stop in the middle of the stem. It produces those cinnamon colored fertile fronds, and then it resumes growing the sterile fronds above it again, so that the entire frond is interrupted by the reproductive structures. But I do really like this one, again, because it's a strong upright grower, and it's not one that tends to flop and open up, and is pretty stout when it comes to, you know, heavy downpours and rain and those sorts of things. And here you can see a whole bunch of them growing together in a natural area. Christmas fern, I think, is a favorite one. It's pretty abundant and common in the horticultural trade. It is an evergreen fern, and you know, these are some of the pictures of the fronds first opening up, and it can over time produce pretty large stands. This was an unusual area in North Jersey that I saw years ago that was just full of Christmas fern. But for the most part, they don't seed around very much. They stay put, and they make bigger and bigger and bigger clumps. I don't know if we can see this particularly well, but one of the reasons it gets called Christmas fern, and if you look in the top right picture, you'll see the individual leaflet has a little, let me see where my pointer is, has a little triangle shape. And so way back when, I suppose, when people were naming plants, they thought this kind of looked like a Christmas stocking. And so it got named Christmas fern. I also suspect that because it was evergreen, that it was also collected for Christmas wreaths and Christmas boughs, and for seasonal displays at that time of year. Now we're going to get into the wood ferns. And wood ferns, from an ID standpoint, can be a little bit tricky. There are also hybrids of them. And so if you're looking to identify wood ferns out in the wild, I can share with you a couple good ID books. But my first wood fern here is called Goldie's fern. Goldie's fern has and so what I should say, I should back up and say that identification of ferns, you have to look at a number of different things. You have to look at the entire shape of the frond. You have to look at whether there are scales or hairs on the stem or the stipe. And you also need to look at the arrangement of the reproductive structures, as you can see on the bottom right here. These are individual, called a sori, and that's where the spores are produced, or sorus, excuse me, and then sori in plural. And how they're arranged can be diagnostic. You can also see that there's a kind of a pale cover that covers up the spore-bearing structures until they're ripe and ready to release the spores. But Goldie's fern has a narrow sort of triangular shape at the end of the frond. It's a fairly upright, again, about under 4 foot, usually about 2 to 3 foot in size fern, and it's a good accent, again, because it's clumping, and it's not one that's going to run or seed around very well. I skipped a lot of the other wood ferns, again, just so that we're not boring you with umpteen wood ferns, but there's quite a bit out there, and there are a lot of really wonderful ones. But I wanted to get to the running ferns because I like this group because a lot of them can actually act as a really nice ground cover, and they can hold space, they can outcompete weeds, and it's really easy to pair them with plants or shrubs that are strong growers that can get up through that mass of fronds. You know, if you use these well in a garden setting, you won't spend any more money on mulch, which is pretty great. So sensitive fern is the first one up. Again, sensitive fern, when it first comes out of the ground, it's really kind of otherworldly looking. But here it is at BBG in a nice little corner bed, and paired really nicely with some wild geraniums and some pinkster bloom azaleas. Again, it only gets about maybe 2 foot tall, so it's not a particularly tall one. I've also seen this growing in full sun, but in wet meadow situations. So again, not a particularly drought tolerant fern, and there's a couple others coming up that I can point to that are more drought tolerant. When it is ready, it also makes completely separate fertile fronds from sterile fronds. And so the fertile fronds are going to look green when they first emerge, and then they'll turn dark brown or dark brown to black, as you can see on the left of the top right picture. And those will persist long after the sterile fronds melt away. And the reason it's called sensitive fern is because the fronds really begin to deteriorate after the first frost. And so that's the connection with the term sensitive. Ostrich fern is another good running fern. This is the edible crozier's plant. So if you're into eating fiddleheads in the springtime, you can grow this and harvest your own. They tend to make nice little colonies that will spread over time. Older, more established fronds will be bigger. In the wild, I have seen this plant produce fronds upwards of 5 to 6 feet tall. But in most cultivated settings, I've only ever seen it, again, right around the 3 foot mark. So again, nothing that's really going to overwhelm. But it is a fairly strong grower. It does prefer wet conditions, and it's easy to move it around. It's another one that you can, and that's one of the things I'll talk about when we talk about the propagation portion of all of this. That what unites the running ferns group is that they all grow through underground rhizomes that can be severed, dug up, and moved into another place. So with some patience, you can make a lot more of these very easily. So a couple more scenes here. Similarly, like sensitive fern, ostrich fern here makes completely separate fertile fronds. They look very different than the sterile fronds. and they'll be born in the center of the clump, and you'll look to those to turn dark before they're ready to shed their spores. Next, we've got a whole group of much lower ferns. These are New York fern and marsh fern. Both of these top out at under 2 feet, so I think they're really great choices for shady garden beds where you need a lot of quick coverage. New York fern, again here, and marsh fern that's been paired with a sundrop, an Unathera. To tell the two apart, and I put this here side by side. So the frond for New York fern tapers at the tip, and then it also tapers all the way down at the base. And you can see how the pinnae here, the leaflets, grow increasingly smaller and smaller, and they kind of burn down. And so, as a former resident of New York City for over 20 years. The adage was that New York fern are like New Yorkers that burn the candle at both ends. So you work hard and you play hard. Marsh fern, on the other hand, tapers at the tip, but then it stops abruptly about, say, 3/4 of the way. So you're not going to get that reduction of smaller leaflets going down further down. But New York fern, I would say, is a slightly more drought tolerant, as the name marsh fern suggests. Again, it is one that really likes more consistently moist conditions. Now, hay-scented fern is a very, very common fern. You see it in almost all the woodlands around here. It is particularly drought tolerant, and it's a clonal shrub. And so this is one that I think can be used more widely in gardens, but with a note of caution in that unless you're pairing it with something that can get taller than it, it will quickly overwhelm and swallow up any kind of smaller or low-growing plants. So just be careful about how you pair this together. As I said, it's drought tolerant. It gets its name from the fact that once the weather begins to cool and we start getting frosts, all those lovely green turn to this wonderful hay scented color or hay brown color, and you also get that that aroma of freshly mown hay. This is a plant that deer won't eat. In fact, I should say that deer really won't eat any ferns because the fronds themselves contain a lot of silicates, which is bad for their teeth, and it gives them an upset stomach. And so they avoid eating ferns. When you walk into a woodland and you see an acre of hay-scented fern, it's a beautiful sight because it makes it look sort of park-like. But it's also something that should tell you that there's a lot of deer around because they've eaten everything else. They've eaten all the tree seedlings. They've eaten anything else that they could, and have eliminated the competition for hay-scented fern, which is quite happy to move in those kinds of conditions. This one I think is a little bit more unusual for New England. It's called Virginia chain fern. Again, this is a fern of wet meadows, fronds up to about 3 feet tall or so. Again, used to be in a different genus, used to be called Woodwardia virginica. Here on Long Island, it's growing right up to and practically in standing water. So again, this is a great fern for if you want to pair it with royal fern, if you have the edge of a pond or a marsh, or even a stream. It's a really great fern. The sort of more diminutive cousin of this is what's called netted chain fern. And this one is also a running fern. It really needs consistent moisture. It looks similar to sensitive fern, but has some key differences. Next, I want to talk about one of my favorite groups within the running ferns, which are called the beach ferns. These tend to be somewhat more drought tolerant. They grow about under 2 foot, 2 foot tall. Broad beach fern has these really strongly triangular fronds like this. They've got a really nice texture to them. Again, this was a picture of as those fronds are just emerging, so they do expand a little bit more. And this is sort of the bigger of the two species that we have in New England. The other one is a little bit more diminutive, called Long Beach fern, and because the tip of the frond is really much more longer and tapering. At Garden of the Woods, we have this fern as a ground cover in our woodland, and interplanted into it in the springtime is a lot of white wake robin, Trillium grandiflorum, and the trillium is really blooming as the fronds are beginning to emerge. So it's a wonderful timing sort of a thing. And then as the trilliums are finished and begin to fade, the ferns take over. And then interspersed in that, we've got a whole bunch of white woodland aster and other things to kind of hold the space. So this is a really fantastic ground cover fern. Again, it ought to be much more widely available than it is. Lastly, in the running ferns, and this is the cutest and the smallest fern of the running fern group, is called oak fern or northern oak fern. This grows maybe 4 to 6 inches tall, and that's about it. It's very delicate. It's small. Again, sighting this, you got to make sure that it's not in an area that has lots of heavy leaf litter, but it's a really charming little plant. And the exact opposite of this is bracken fern. And I love bracken fern because the way the fronds kind of come out of the ground in the early part of the spring is almost otherworldly. It doesn't really look like a fern quite yet. And you have these kind of ethereal stems reaching out of the ground. But once it expands, it is a tough customer. Here again in New Jersey, it's moved in after a fire. It has really deep rhizomes. And I just want to be very clear with this next statement. Please be really sure that you want bracken fern in your garden before you plant it, because once it gets established, you will not be able to get rid of it. It's great for gardens that have more space. I would not recommend this for anybody that has a smaller garden or a city garden, as it's likely to overwhelm all your plants, or you'll spend all your time thinning it and trying to pull it out. So this next group here is a group that falls into kind of a nice middle ground, which I call slowly spreading ferns. And so they tend to be clump forming, but then the clumps spread and move a little bit more. And so this group contains our northern lady fern, and in particular, this selection called Lady in Red, which is characterized for the red stipes or stems that come out of the ground. This was a plant that was actually first discovered at Garden in the Woods 20, 30 years ago, but nobody thought to patent it, so we kind of missed out on retiring rich on a fern cultivar, but there you go. Here it is again, just really lovely contrast of new foliage and wonderful dark red stems. And those stems will stay red all throughout the whole season. Bulblet fern is another one of these kind of specialty ferns. It has very long, narrow fronds and is characterized by producing these little bulbils, which break off and then form new fronds. So this one's fairly easy in terms of reproduction, as long as you can get your hands on some of those little bulblets. Otherwise, it does make plenty of these little spore-bearing structures that you can harvest and grow from later on. Cystopteris tenuis is another diminutive fern, again about 6 to 8 inches, and likes somewhat dry, rocky slopes. Cinnamon fern, as you can see, is another one of these ferns that has separate sterile fronds and fertile fronds. The fertile fronds are the ones in that looks like a cinnamon stick coming up out of the ground. This is a much more robust fern, up to 5-6 feet tall if it's very happy, and will slowly make more and more of itself. In the springtime, the new fronds emerge completely covered in this cool white hair. And then in the fall, the fronds turn this really magnificent bronzy kind of a color. So you get some good fall color out of them as well. Cinnamon fern is a good one. Maidenhair fern, despite its delicate look, I think is actually a much tougher plant than what people give it credit for. It's called pedatum because of the way that each frond looks like a horseshoe, it's kind of a horseshoe shape out of which all of the side branches and pinnae emerge. And again, maybe under 2 foot tall. And very clump forming. Early springtime, it has this wonderful transformation of these really wonderful maroon, tightly curled crosiers that come out of the ground, and then they begin to open up and droop, and they turn in, maybe even a little bit lighter of a bronze color before fully flushing out and becoming green. We have a section at Garden in the Woods that's a combination of maidenhair fern, of bishop's wort, mitella, and false meadow rue, and it's like a little fairy playground in May. It's just a wonderful, delicate display that I'm a big fan of. Rock polypody is a great plant. You oftentimes find it growing in cracks or in shallow depressions on rocks. Again, over time, it can form some pretty nice colonies. This one here, I took a picture of that was in the Adirondacks. I would imagine that this is likely decades, if not 100 years old. Just this magnificent sweep of this fern coming down this little rock face here. This one is available, and it's a good evergreen fern, and each frond, under 8-10 inches long, so it's not particularly tall fern by any means. And then we got a couple that are a little less known. So silvery spleenwort, Deparia. Now we're going to sort of transition a little bit here to ferns that really like high pH soils. So these are ones that tend to be restricted to limestone areas and areas that grow that have sweeter soils. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some rare and unusual ferns as well, because there's some really wonderful ones in there. And you can see some of the pH specialists also fall onto this list, as well as those kind of conditions are not very common out in New England. And so these, I think, as a group, tend to be really difficult to propagate and to grow, but doesn't mean that we can't appreciate them. So we'll start with Green Mountain maidenhair fern. This is an endemic to the Green Mountains of Vermont, very narrow. It looks a lot like our regular maidenhair fern with some key morphological differences, but otherwise pretty much would grow in similar conditions as long as you can have high pH soils. Hart's tongue fern is a federally listed fern that is distinct because it has entire fronds, and then you get these bands of spore structures. This is a funny story from Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, where we were growing this in the native plant garden, and then in the middle of the road, about 100 yards away from the native plant garden, was a drainage grate. And one day I was walking around and I saw this frond peeking out in between the grate, and it looked suspiciously familiar. And so we removed the drainage grate, and then growing in the side walls of this basically drainage pit were just completely, covering with Hart's tongue fern. And the only explanation I can have is that whatever they used to build that drainage vault must have been limestone in some way. And in the miracle of plants and their resilience, spores at some point had blown from our plants in the garden and gotten washed into this thing. And the size of the plant sort of led me to think that, they'd been growing there for at least 20 years or more. And this is a federally listed plant growing in a drainage ditch in the middle of Brooklyn. Like, amazing story. So those plants were rescued out of the drain and planted out in the garden to supplant the display there. One of my favorites to find in the wild and very impossible to grow is called walking fern. And walking fern has these really, really super long tips on the ends of the fronds, and wherever they meet and touch the moss, they'll root and produce new fronds. So it literally walks over a mossy boulder, just so you can see here on the left and the right. A super unusual one. Again, really preferring the right kinds of rock substrate. The other thing you'll notice is that almost all of these have a very dense covering of moss, which helps to keep conditions moist and ideal for them to root into the tips. And then you get a little detail of the spore-bearing structures on the other side. This one's a weird one. I've only seen it a couple times. It's called wall rue spleenwort. It's a very small little fern that exists in the cracks and crevices of limestone areas. Maybe a couple inches across in size. I don't know anybody that's successfully cultivated this one, but it's out there, so it's a pretty neat one. Glade fern is one that we do grow at Garden in the Woods, and is a slowly spreading kind of a clump former. It has entire pinnae or leaflets that are not divided, and I think is a great plant that should be used a little bit more often. Then we've got some weird stuff. We've got batriciums, and so these are called moonworts or great ferns. And they do this, again, they display this dimorphism with sterile fronds on the bottom and then fertile fronds at the top. They can have highly dissected leaves, so this is Batricium dissectum, and otherwise, again, these are plants I've only ever seen out in the wild and never in anybody's garden. Add to that another weirdo, which is called adder's tongue fern. So this is Ophioglossum pusillum. And Ophioglossum is a strange record holder in the world of plants. Plants are capable of harboring multiple copies of their entire genome. So if humans have 3 copies instead of 2, it leads to things like trisomies or conditions like Down syndrome or other sorts of developmental problems. Plants, on the other hand, can have 3 copies, 4 copies, 6 copies, 10 copies, all the way up to Ophioglossum, which was studied and learned and discovered that it had over 400 copies of its genome. So why? Well, that's maybe a discussion for another time, but it's a very odd plant. It's a rare plant. It grows very slowly. Maybe having all those extra copies has something to do with it. But again, it's out there and it's part of the weird world of ferns. Next, we've got Pellia, which is called a cliff break. This is a plant that is a specialist of limestone cliffs and crevices. Again, has a pretty distinct looking frond. And quite drought tolerant once it's established. You can see here earlier, other scenes earlier on. Hairy lip fern is one that is also very drought tolerant, again, because it's completely covered in all those fine hairs that you can see, and the fronds are also very fuzzy and soft and kind of silvery in appearance, so it's a very drought tolerant rock crevice specialist. We have a fern that is a vine. This is called climbing fern, and it makes these really wonderful little leaflets here. And the fern climbs on whatever structure is nearby, so it doesn't have tendrils, but it kind of winds itself around. It might grow, maybe 5 to 6 feet in a season. but that's about it. This plant also has a distinction of being the subject of the nation's very first plant conservation law, a law that was passed in Connecticut, banning the harvest of climbing fern for wreaths and so forth because it was being over-harvested for Christmas decorations. At the time, I think there was a fine of $10 levied for if you were caught doing it. Later on, that law was amended to say that if you were caught harvesting this plant at night or in disguise, the fine would be doubled, which kind of leads you to believe that enough people didn't think it was serious. I also like the idea of people disguising themselves to go collect a fern. But anyway, curly grass fern, another weird fern that exists in the New Jersey pine barrens and then up into Nova Scotia. There's been several unsuccessful efforts to locate this plant in Massachusetts, although the conditions for it to grow here are correct and right. It exists as these little curly Q fronds. These are, again, this is sphagnum moss for scale, so maybe an inch or two. And then these really neat looking fertile fronds, which to me look like kind of a rudimentary toothbrush that emerge out and show up a little bit later on. Cliff fern, as the name suggests, again, very drought tolerant, rusty because of that sort of tan and copper color that shows up. And then we've got aquatic ferns, and we'll show you two examples of aquatic ferns before we move on to propagation. Water spangles here are Salvinia minima. It's actually a fern that grows aquatics in the right kinds of water conditions. It can be very vigorous, and I think it's maybe even considered a invasive plant in places like Florida. The other aquatic fern that we have in the region here is called mosquito fern or azolla, and that's what these little dark maroon clumps are. So ferns are interesting. They grow as aquatics. They grow on cliffs. They've really adapted to a wide variety of life. So to wrap up tonight, let's talk a little bit about how to grow ferns. And so first thing you want to do is you need to be able to collect spores. We'll talk a little bit about the storage of spores, how to sow them, and we'll talk a little bit about how to make ferns by rhizome cuttings. And of course, ferns are not for people that need or people that expect immediate gratification. So they grow slowly. And so certainly, as we are all gardeners in one way or another, we understand the need for patience when it comes to growing these plants. So ferns have an interesting life cycle. Okay, so you start off with a mature plant. It creates a sporangium. The spores are released, and then the first thing that happens once the spore grows is it makes this little filmy heart-shaped leaf structure that's called a prothallus. And then on that leaf structure, you've got the female part and the male part separated again. So the female parts are always at the top of the heart, and the male parts are down at the bottom of the heart. You need water present to be able to create a film so that the sperm can swim to the egg. And once it's fertilized, then you get a new young fern plant that will grow up to resemble all of the ferns that we've seen so far in the talk today. Only these ones that are in the sort of pinkish color here have the full genetic complement. So the spore, the prothallus, all have only half of it because it's making both male and female parts. So one of the strategies for spore-bearing plants is, and one of the big differences between spore-bearing plants and seed-bearing plants is that spores have no nutritional value. They have, there's no energy for that young plant to get going. And so rather than the, sort of contrast like with an acorn, for example. So an acorn has a whole bunch of energy and nutritive tissue packaged into it that will give that young oak tree the ability to put a root out and put some leaves out, and sometimes perhaps less than ideal conditions for germination. Spore-bearing plants, on the other hand, have gone the strategy of just flooding the environment with millions of spores in the hopes that a few of them may be blown, splashed, or washed into the right kind of place for more ferns to grow. So when you collect spores, what you do is you clip off a frond that has mature spore-bearing structures on it. You put it on a white piece of paper in a place that isn't windy, and then you walk away and you leave it alone overnight. And you come back, and when you gently lift up the frond, what's left on the right-hand side is called a spore print. And so that is where, because things are drier, the plant is responding to less humidity, and it has dropped all of those spores onto the sheet of paper that you can then collect. So do they really drop, or do they do something else? And so this is a really fun video that shows that when spores, so this is a microscope of those little spore-bearing structures, and I find this fascinating. So what's happening here is that instead of just opening up and passively dropping, each little spore-bearing structure functions like a mini catapult. And as the air gets drier, these little guys uncurl, and then like a little catapult, they say, "Here you go, spores," and they pop out the spores and they throw them a little distance away. And so again, as the air is getting drier, these little structures open up. There's a little cup, and it goes pop, pop, and away the spores go. It's absolutely fascinating. I just love that. So here's what it looks like. You take glade ferns, you put them on a piece of paper. The next day, you've got a nice spore print. You put those together, and with this penny for comparison, you've got probably about 10 million spores here. So that's a lot. That's a lot. So when I say that a little bit goes a long way, a little bit goes a long way. They can be stored for short periods of time. We tend to like these sort of glassine envelopes as opposed to the coin envelopes here, simply because the spores are so tiny that they escape out the sides of the coin envelopes. But these little glassines are perfect, and you have a little package for that, and you're good to go. The next thing you want to do is you want to take some potting soil, and you want to sterilize it as much as possible. And so we recommend putting it into the microwave, for example, until you get somewhere around 150, 160 degrees. And then after it's cooled off, you want to slowly and very carefully shake some of those spores out onto the surface of the pot, but don't over sow it. This is, I can't stress this enough. Really do it carefully and sparingly. And then really all you have to do is then put that into a Ziploc bag, put it into a bright window, not one that's necessarily in full sunlight. It just needs indirect light. And after a couple of weeks, you should begin to see these really wonderful little structures growing on the surface. And so this is that little prothallus. And you can see this stuff is thin, okay? You can see each individual cell layer here. And I would even say that this was oversown with spores because the prothalluses are growing on top of each other. But somewhere in here, there's going to be that exchange of male and female parts, and that will eventually lead to the formation of that very first frond that looks a lot like the fern that you're expecting. And then over time, those prothalluses here will kind of fade away and rot away as the plant takes over. From sowing to the formation of the prothallus to this this little finished plant here, that was about 10 to 12 weeks under ideal conditions. So it doesn't take that long to make a little fern plant. All of the ones that were the running ferns are going to be producing these really nice underground rhizomes. And again, if you're comfortable with dividing perennials, this is really no different. You dig these up, and then with a clean razor blade, you can chop them into sections as long as there's some growing tissue, either a new bud coming up or existing ones in the back. You could chop it right here, for example, and make 2 ferns. And this is sensitive fern as the example. So all of these are super easy to do to make more ferns in that way. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. And this is my contact information. If you all have any questions or follow-up questions that you haven't thought of today, please feel free to shoot me an email. And better yet, if you're local, come visit Garden in the Woods. We'll be open until mid-October, and then we'll be closing for the season. So with that, thank you very much. And I will
thank you, Uli.
Here and happy to answer questions.
Any chance that you're willing to hang out for a couple minutes for any questions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank
you, Uli. Appreciate it.
It's a lot of information to squeeze into an hour, so
it is. It was great. I learned a lot about ferns, and I appreciate them way more. Thank you. So if anybody has any questions, you can either post them in the chat or feel free to come off mute and ask your question live.
Yeah. I'm gonna put my email address in the chat as well again, just so that
that's great.
Anybody's feeling shy and they don't want to answer a question now, I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. So I will say that sourcing ferns can sometimes be tough. Because they are slow to grow, there's not that many nurseries that offer them. But there are a couple of good ones there. The Garden of the Woods has a decent offering, probably better in the spring than necessarily right now. I'd also say that places like Van Berkom Nursery is another good one. They offer a pretty decent selection of the common stuff. But some of the more specialty ones, you're likely going to have to either cast a wider net or consider trying to grow some of your own, which I think is really satisfying to be able to do it if you're patient enough.
Any questions?
Well, let's just end again and say that my email is there. If folks have any questions and follow-up, I'm happy to answer them. And I hope that everyone appreciates ferns just a little bit more than they did before.
I have a question.
Sure.
I have a stone wall under some oak trees, etc. And I was thinking of putting a large mass of hay-scented ferns under them, but I was a little concerned with their aggressiveness and with the fact that they tend to look very, very depleted towards the end of the season. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions that might be some other ferns that would be good, kind of almost a good mixture, so to speak, so I don't have just a monoculture.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would try some of the broadbeach ferns, and the trouble with hay scented is they do tend to dominate over time. What I would perhaps suggest in your particular situation is maybe pair it with some asters or goldenrods or something that'll give you a little bit of a focus, maybe some color in that area for the fall as the hay-scented ferns kind of begin to senesce and it depends too. If I feel like the fronds look really great, and then like if a branch falls down on it, then it's sort of dented for the season. And so my suggestion would be to pair it again with something a little bit different. And so there's some great like heartleaf aster. There's some good goldenrods that aren't super aggressive that I think would be able to hold their own with the hay-scented fern.
Would underplanting in certain spots like Christmas fern, would that work, or it would just eat it all up?
Well, I mean, Christmas fern I think is just not robust enough to hang against it.
Okay.
And I think that it's a better sort of accent on its own rather than mixing it in with the other ones. Again, I don't know how much moisture is in your situation. The other one I might consider trying is interrupted fern. And because it's a little bit taller, it has a little bit more of a stature, or Goldie's fern is another one that can give you a little bit different texture, different sort of shade of green, and it's a little bit more robust and would pair nicely with the other ones. So,
thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so a couple questions in here. So Priscilla asked, timing of establishing fern planting in a wet area. I mean, spring or fall is really great. I think, you know, if you can get established plants into the ground and there's consistent moisture, you know, I think traditionally people really talk about spring as being the time for doing all your plantings. But I'm hearing from a number of folks now that fall actually works really well, and that you ought to spend your time in spring trying to get it weeding and other sorts of pursuits. So as long as the moisture is consistent, either time of year works well. And again, I think that balancing the timing with the availability of the ferns is another concern. Many ferns tend to come into the garden centers in the springtime when they're first coming up, and you might have a hard time sourcing or getting having more choice in the fall. So for that reason alone, I think spring is probably where I would aim for. So, so how aggressive are the wet soil tolerant ferns? So using them in a bioretention or like a swale kind of garden, I mean, I think if you're worried about them outgrowing other plants, I would skew towards things like cinnamon fern and royal fern, which are kind of clump forming or more slowly spreading ferns, and kind of shy away from maybe the Virginia chain fern, which I think is probably the most aggressive of the wet loving ones that I showed you. And, you know, again, depending on what you're pairing it with, and how consistently moist it is, sensitive fern, I think, is always placed nicely with other plants, and I don't find it to be quite as aggressive as chain fern does. So, suggestions for pairings for wetland ferns in the Mid-Atlantic. Well, let's see. I mean, we're talking about sun or shade. If you've got sunny conditions, I think there's a whole lot of stuff you can do. Hibiscus, you can do like ironweeds, cattails. You know, again, I don't know how wet is wet and what gradient you are in terms of what you're working with. So I don't think I'd stay away from things like cardinal flower or blue lobelia, as I don't think that they're robust enough. Yeah, rain gardens, yeah, colonie, hibiscus. Again, in that kind of a situation, go for a cinnamon fern, because it does take drier conditions, but can also be inundated for short periods of time. And aesthetically, I think cinnamon fern, you know, you've got good upright structure, you've got the contrast of the fertile fronds and the sterile fronds, and you've got great fall color. So that would be the one that I would recommend in a rain garden situation. And then, like I said, avoid smaller statured things. As much as cardinal flower is great, I don't think that they do well in those sorts of situations. So those ones, New York aster, soft rushes, the juncus are usually very good in terms of being tolerant of wet and dry conditions. Similarly, blue flag iris is another one that pairs really nicely in those sorts of situations, and gives you a little bit more color earlier on. And if there's something that stays on the wetter side in that situation, then try some royal fern. So those would be my suggestions. Okay. Well, again, let me just reiterate that my email is in the chat. If folks have other questions or follow-up afterwards, I'm happy to answer them. Again, thank you for the kind comments and supportive comments in the chat. Yeah, if you're ever in the area, come visit Garden in the Woods. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uli. Appreciate it. And please note, we put the evaluation link in the chat as well. We're always trying to improve, so any feedback you can provide us is appreciated. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Have a lovely evening.
Peggy, can we?
Yeah.
I missed the first couple minutes. Can I go back and listen to that? Is that possible, or would that not be available till tomorrow?
That won't be available until later. Yeah.
Okay, great. How can I access it when it is available?
You will be sent the link.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks.